Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. Before we get started with today's episode, if you could just make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast from where you're listening or watching, and also give us a thumbs up, leave a review, or drop a comment. In today's episode, I want to talk about three things that often get collapsed into one: validation, agreement, and accepting influence. Couples will sometimes say, well, I can't validate that because it isn't true. Or one partner will say, you're asking me to agree with you, and I don't. Sometimes one partner has learned the language of validation and will say, your feelings are valid, but their partner still leaves the conversation feeling unseen. Often that happens because these three concepts, validation, agreement, and accepting influence, are often related and intertwined in the relational process, but they're also different. We can validate someone without agreeing with every conclusion they reach. We can agree about a fact without validating the emotional experience. And we can say all of the right validating words while refusing to allow our partner to influence us. When I'm working with couples, I will sometimes use an ambiguous black and white drawing with couples. It's usually called my wife and my mother-in-law, which is a problem. I didn't realize that until I was looking for the image. I don't know if I learned it this way or if this is just what I called it, the beautiful young woman and the old hag, because the older woman reminds me of the old woman in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs who brings Snow White the apple. Anyway, hopefully that jogs your memory and you can also recall the image. I will use this image sometimes in my session when I'm working with couples. And when people look at it, usually most people have seen it. Some people, when they first saw it, immediately saw the young woman wearing a feathered hat and what looks like a fur collar. Other people, when they first saw it, immediately saw the older woman with a prominent nose and chin. If you imagine that partner A sees the young woman and partner B sees the older woman, and neither knows that the drawing actually contains two images, they can start arguing about what the picture actually is. One might say, what do you mean you see the young woman? Partner B responds, well, look, there's her jawline. This is her ear. Partner B says, there's no young woman. That is clearly an image of an older woman. Both are accurately reporting what they can see. The problem is that each person assumes that what they see is all there is to see. You have the person tracing the image of what they saw. Maybe it's the young woman's necklace, and that becomes the older woman's mouth. What one saw as the young woman's jaw becomes the older woman's nose. And suddenly, both people can see what their partner saw. Nothing in the drawing changed. What changed was each person's capacity to see something that had been there all along. When they look at the drawing the next time, they probably still see the image that they initially saw. Our brains tend to return to the familiar organization. But they also have that awareness that there is an other image that is equally valid, and the other image, the second image, becomes familiar in the drawing. Their original perception of what they saw didn't necessarily have to go away. It wasn't wrong. But their understanding can grow because now they can also see what their partner saw. Relationships are more complex than an optical illusion. Facts matter, history matters, the power dynamics in the relationship matter. And sometimes one person has incomplete or incorrect information. Sometimes someone's not being honest. Other times there is actual harm that needs accountability. And I'm not suggesting that every conflict is simply two equally accurate versions of the same picture. But this drawing does give us a simple way to understand some important concepts. Our inability to see what another person does not automatically mean there's nothing there to see. When I teach validation, I do not define it as simply telling someone your feelings are valid. That can become a phrase we say without actually doing the work of understanding the person. I usually describe validation this way. If I am you, not if I'm placed into your circumstances, but if I am literally you, and I know your backstory, your family of origin, your relationship history, your sensitivities, the experiences that have shaped you, and what this particular moment represented to you, then I can understand why it landed the way it did. I'm literally taking this other person's perspective and making it make sense. People will sometimes say, well, if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't have reacted that way. The problem is they're imagining themselves with their nervous system, their history, their resources, and their meanings standing in their partner's shoes. That's not really quite the same thing as trying to understand what it is like to be them. The validating question is not, would I have had the same response? Instead, it's knowing what I know about you. Can I understand how you got there? Validation simply says, if I am you with your history and the meaning that's held for you, I can understand why you felt, interpreted, or responded the way you did. Validation may involve several different levels. For example, emotion is one of the layers. We may validate and understand the other person's emotion, but we may not validate the impact. For example, we might say, I can understand why being on my phone left you feeling unimportant. We can understand that. So we might understand the meaning. I can see how that moment came to represent that you are alone in this relationship. I might also understand their interpretation. Given our history, I can understand why you concluded I was avoiding you. But it's also true that validating one layer does not require us to validate every layer. For example, we might understand why they became angry without agreeing that yelling was an acceptable behavior. Another example is we can believe that the impact was real, even if we remembered some of the details differently. We might understand how our partner reached a conclusion without agreeing that their conclusion is the most accurate description of the other person's motives. Making sense of behavior is not the same as approving of it. Context does help us understand behavior, but that understanding does not automatically remove accountability for the behavior. Agreement is different. Agreement means I reached essentially the same conclusion you did. We may agree about the facts, the meaning, the problem, and the solution. But agreement is not required for validation. One partner might say, I don't agree that I never prioritize you. And I can also understand why last night left you feeling unimportant. That's not evasive if the person is genuinely trying to understand the impact. They're also holding their own perspective while making room for their partners. The reverse can also happen. Someone can agree about the facts and still fail to validate the experience. For example, one person might say, yes, I was late. I already admitted that. We agree about that fact, right? But then they might add, what else do you want from me? That's factual agreement, but it contains very little curiosity about why their being late mattered or what it meant for their partner. Agreement by itself doesn't necessarily create connection. And validation does not require us to manufacture agreement that's not there. One of the reasons this distinction is so important is that we can hurt someone when we're not intending to hurt them. A person may think, if I did not intend to hurt you, then you feeling like you were hurt must be wrong. But those statements actually answer different questions. I did not intend to hurt you describes what was happening inside the person who acted. I was hurt by what happened describes what happened inside the person on the receiving end. Both can be true. One person's hurt doesn't prove intent by the other person. And the fact that the other person did not intend to hurt them doesn't prove that no harm occurred. In couples work, it's not uncommon that one partner is talking about impact while the other is defending intention. The hurt person says, when you kept looking at your phone while I was talking, I felt like I didn't matter. And the other person may respond, well, that's not what I was trying to communicate. I was waiting for an important email. You knew that. The explanation may be relevant because the other person's intention does matter. But it also should address the experience being described. Their partner may not be accusing them of deliberately deciding, I want you
to feel unimportant right now.
They may be saying, this is what happened inside me in response to you continuing to check your phone while I was talking to you. A more relational response might be, I was not trying to communicate that you did not matter, but I will acknowledge I was preoccupied with the email. And knowing that you have spent a lot of your life trying to get people to stay present with you, it makes sense to me why my behavior would land that way. That response does not require a false confession of malicious intent. It allows intention and impact to coexist. Good intentions provide meaningful context, but they're not a relational exemption. Our intention tells us something important about us, but it doesn't tell us everything about what happened to the other person. This brings us to accepting influence. Accepting influence goes beyond simply being able to repeat back what our partner said. When I was in the 8th grade, I had an algebra class. Maybe it was geometry, one of those two. And I was a talker. It didn't really matter who the teacher sat me by. I was going to make friends with them and I was going to talk with them. Mrs. Anderson often would call me out for talking to other people. Even when her back was turned and she was writing on the chalkboard, she would hear talking and my maiden name is McAdams. So she would say, McAdams, stop talking. It's my time to talk. She would call me out and say, McAdams, stop talking. You need to be learning. Sometimes she would say, you're not listening, McAdams. What did I just say? And I could pretty much repeat verbatim what she had just said, even though I was actually talking to whoever was sitting next to me. Where Mrs. Anderson was actually correct, though, is me being able to repeat back word for word what she had just said did not mean I was learning. My understanding of math significantly fell behind that year. My social group expanded. Accepting influence means our partner's experience matters to us. What they have shared may affect our understanding, the weight we give an issue, a decision we make, or how we act going forward. Accepting influence doesn't mean compliance. It doesn't require self-abandonment. And it doesn't mean that our partner automatically gets their preferred outcome. It simply means I'm open to the possibility that knowing what my partner sees may expand, enlighten, or evolve how I see things. So let me summarize these three concepts. Validation would say, I understand how you got there. Agreement says, I got there too. Accepting influence says, what you have shared is allowed to affect me. Sometimes that influence is visible and we change our mind. Sometimes it results in a changed behavior. Sometimes we recognize that an issue might deserve more weight than we initially gave it. Other times we might revise our interpretation going forward. Sometimes we might still disagree, but we can also represent our partner's position fairly instead of reducing it to something unreasonable. One of the things that I watch for in a couple session is after their partner shared their experience, did the other partner include their version as well as their own version going forward when they talk about that event? Or I might ask, after one partner shares their experience, is anything different in the way that they see what unfolded? And can they represent that? The final decision may remain the same. I'm also looking for, did their understanding of their partner change? Maybe it was the meaning of the issue that changed. They became more curious. They modified how they approached the problem. And they start to recognize a reasonable part of their partner's position. If a person tells their partner that their feelings are valid, but their partner's experience is not allowed to affect them, eventually that validation starts to feel hollow. It begins to sound like their partner will use the correct words, but nothing their partner says alters how they understand things or what they do next. Often that can feel like they're weaponizing what they're learning in therapy. There is a term that helps us understand the internal posture that's required for validation and accepting influence: epistemic humility. The word epistemic refers to knowledge, how we know what we know. Epistemic humility means that we recognize what we believe could be incomplete and that additional information could add to or complicate, challenge, or correct our understanding. In practical language, it means that we keep a few possibilities available to ourselves. We might be wrong. We might be partly right and be missing some parts. We might have forgotten an important factor. And we may not have communicated as clearly as we thought we did. It can also mean that we keep in the back of our mind that our memory might not be complete, or our partner may have information or an experience that we have not considered. Epistemic humility means that we can trust what we know without assuming that we know everything. It's not the same as insecurity or chronic self-doubt. We do have an ability to trust ourselves. But it's also not saying that facts do not exist or that truth is entirely subjective or every interpretation is equally accurate and deserves equal weight. Some interpretations are better supported by the evidence. But sometimes one person has incorrect information. Sometimes there might be a pattern of manipulation or harm. But if we're not asking for other perspectives and being open, we can't assume there are no other valid perspectives. If we have not asked questions, sought additional information, or genuinely listened, we can't responsibly claim that our perspective is the whole picture. And genuinely asking matters. We can technically ask for our partner's perspective while listening only for where the argument is weak and we're able to attack or defend. Epistemic humility includes the possibility that what I hear could actually change something inside of me or how I see things external to me. This is why I encourage my individual clients, as well as the couples I work with, to be generous with their assumptions. By generous, I do not mean inventing a positive explanation that contradicts the evidence. I simply mean beginning with the most charitable interpretation that is reasonably consistent with what we know about this person. I think it's often safe to assume that we may have been less clear than we thought when we were communicating. It's also safe to assume that our partner might have heard something that we did not intend. Maybe we forgot a detail. Maybe this response is connected to more than this one moment. And it's also possible that my partner's behavior doesn't mean my partner doesn't care about me. It's usually easy for us to be generous with our assumptions about ourselves. We assume our perception is accurate, our memory is complete, and our communication was clear. But we often give other people a lot less generosity than we do ourselves. The asymmetry can sound like, if I misunderstood you, it's because you were not clear. But if you misunderstood me, it's because you were not listening. A generous assumption is a starting point for inquiry. It's not the final verdict, and it should remain responsive to patterns. One confusing interaction might call for curiosity, but a repeated pattern of deception calls for discernment. Dr. John Gottman identifies accepting influence as an important part of managing conflict. Although it is an important skill for every partner, his research with heterosexual married couples found a notable gender difference. In that research, he found that wives, including wives in unhappy marriages, were generally already taking their husband's opinions and feelings into account. Husbands, though, were less likely to reciprocate. He found that the stability of a heterosexual marriage was strongly connected to whether the husband was willing to accept influence from his wife. This finding does not mean all men resist influence or all women accept it well. And it doesn't describe every couple. So it cannot be applied as an absolute. But I do think it names an important pattern that men may be less likely to see in themselves. A man may consciously believe he is fair and egalitarian while still treating his own perspective as the default. His is the practical, reasonable, or objective position. His wife's perspective then enters the conversation as a challenge to that default. Neglecting influence can begin with an invisible presumption. I am right, and you have to prove me wrong. His memory is presumed reliable. Hers requires corroboration. His priorities are necessities. Hers are preferences. Often his calmness is treated as objectivity, and her intensity becomes evidence that she's irrational. His intention is allowed to explain his behavior, while she has to prove the impact of his behavior on her. Sometimes a husband believes he is open to influence because he's willing to let his wife present her case. But that's not the same thing as shared influence. If he remains the judge who decides whether her experience meets his standard of proof, there's a pretty obvious power dynamic. One of the things I watch for when I'm working with a heterosexual couple is the context in which any individual question is asked. He might be saying, "Can you give me an example?" Or "When did that happen?" And that's coming from genuine curiosity. What I'm trying to discern is he asking questions to truly better understand or jog his memory? Or is he cross-examining his partner until he finds a reason to dismiss the larger concern? Another example appears when a wife says something repeatedly and it's discounted. But the same point might become credible when a male friend or a male therapist or a podcast host or outside expert says it. I hear this even being a female therapist from wives. If I'm in a group with the betrayed partner, often they will say, "My husband will hear it if you say it, Jackie. But if I'm saying the same thing, he won't hear it from me." And that sucks for the partner. I want them to get to the point where they can actually hear it from their wife. Dr. Gottman places this gender difference within a larger cultural change towards shared power. In his book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, he discusses anthropologist Peggy Sanday's work comparing male-dominated and egalitarian cultures. He describes male-dominated cultures as more associated with harsh environmental conditions, food scarcity, men's excessive role in hunting highly valued food, and men's limited participation in infant care. He then points out that in today's world, those conditions have largely changed. Men are no longer the sole breadwinners or hunters for food. And many men want to participate deeply in caring for and raising their children. He describes the emotionally intelligent husband as the next step in social evolution. Women have historically been expected to take men's needs, opinions, authority, and perspectives into account, whether that's their husband, their father, their brother, a male colleague. But men have not been equally required to organize themselves around women's perspectives. And none of us enters a relationship outside of culture. Even a man who consciously believes in equality may have had more practice exercising influence than receiving influence from women. Contemporary partnership requires more than a man who protects and provides. It requires a man who can be affected by the woman he loves. One of the questions that I will often ask the men that I work with is, if your partner tells you she does not feel influential in this relationship, does that make you curious? Or do you want to explain why that's wrong? People do not resist influence only because they do not care. Accepting influence can register inside us as losing or being controlled, admitting incompetence, accepting total blame, or opening the door to unlimited demands. A husband might fear that if they acknowledge one part of their partner's experience, they will be required to agree with all of it. Or they might believe that if their partner's perspective is valid, their own perspective becomes invalid. One of the fears that I often see come up with the men that I work with is, if their partner's emotional pain is valid, how could she possibly love him and stay in a relationship with him? I think there's a legitimate fear there. The question, though, is, can we move that towards empathy for the pain caused in a way that actually trusts the relationship that they eventually rebuild? This is where differentiation matters. Differentiation allows a person to remain separate while also staying emotionally connected. We can let our partner affect us without them defining us. If we've hurt our partner, we can allow that hurt to exist without that defining who we are as a person. We can understand our partner's experience without abandoning our own judgment. And we can revise part of our position without collapsing into thinking that we were wrong about everything. If accepting influence feels like some type of surrender, we will defend ourselves against it, even when our partner is only asking to matter. And there's often a hidden dynamic that I see when one partner's perspective is repeatedly treated as inadmissible without overwhelming proof. That partner usually starts bringing more examples, more details, more context, and more intensity. They raise a concern, it's minimized or debated or dismissed. They try to explain it more precisely. The other person might focus on one wrong word that they used. So they add more examples. The other partner becomes flooded, defensive, or withdrawn. And the first partner becomes increasingly desperate to be taken seriously. And that same intensity, that very intensity, is used as further evidence that their whole perspective is unreasonable. Starting to understand and see this cycle doesn't mean that every intense response is constructive or acceptable. Both people remain responsible for how they behave. But it does help us see what looks like over-explaining that may have actually developed because the other person continued to dismiss their version and allow them to influence them. My husband and I recently had an example of this in our own marriage during a situation that involved our neighbor and a disputed property line. Initially, when the neighbor talked to us and said that he thought the property line was off by 3 feet, we didn't know any different. We had no involvement in determining the property line. And this was a new neighbor who had moved in when the previous neighbor sold the house. So this was news to us, and we had really no information to either tell the new neighbor he was wrong or to agree with him. I think Jeff defaulted to assuming the neighbor was right. And I don't know that I went one way or the other. At the time, Jeff was working from home and the neighbor worked from home. So they would talk about it if they needed to. And when I got home from work, Jeff would fill me in if there had been a conversation or a development. At the time, I was focused on work and updating forms in order to hire new therapists. So I was distracted and busy doing this. Then one Friday afternoon, Jeff mentioned that the neighbor had told him that day that moving the property line would probably impact these 3 trees that we had planted on the side of our house, and that he would want us to move them forward. He said the neighbor said he was going to research it. That caught my attention because I don't really want my neighbor researching something that negatively impacts me and positively impacts him. So I started a Google search looking at how these specific trees would be impacted if we had to move them after 8 years of growth. This took me out into the backyard, looking at the 2 properties behind our house and our neighbor's house and the trees on their property. It actually got me questioning the validity of what our neighbor was arguing. So I came in the house and had Jeff walk out in the backyard for me, explained what I was seeing and the conclusion that I was coming to. I think I even talked about it briefly on a podcast episode. I said, one of the things I know about Jeff and the family he grew up in is they are so conflict avoidant, it often gets in the way of any connection. I will say, Jeff has come a long way and learned how to appropriately handle conflict. He's had to learn it. He's had to learn it for work. He's had to learn it to solve disputes among our kids as they were growing up. And he's had to learn it within our marriage. So I would say He is not that conflict avoidant anymore. But when conflict is initially presented, it makes him uncomfortable. So when I presented my thinking to him, I immediately felt his discomfort. I would describe it as some tension. So I just called attention to it and said, hey, I think this tension that I acknowledge I caused it, may lead us to fight sometime this weekend. He responded saying, Jackie, I'm not trying to fight with you. I said, yeah, no, I know. I'm just saying this feeling here that I know I caused it, could lead us to argue at some point during this weekend. Again, he responded saying, Jackie, I'm not trying to fight with you. At that point, I realized his response made it seem like he thought I was accusing him of something, which I wasn't. So I pivoted and said, well, I might start a fight. Just this feeling of tension that is here that I caused, not for any malicious reason, might end up with us fighting, not about the property line, but about something. I could tell it just wasn't landing right. And timing matters. So I dropped it. We went on a walk, came back, had dinner. Our evening played out. The next morning, Jeff woke up and said, I think I get what you were saying yesterday. Sometimes a good night's sleep does help things settle in. I said, oh, yeah. And he explained, yeah, just the changing of direction brought up some tension that could end up causing the two of us to fight, even though we're not necessarily on different teams. I said, right. I actually shared with him my observation of his family of origin dynamic and asked, do you think that's inaccurate? He said, no, but I don't really want to talk about my whole family dynamic right now. I said, I can see that me changing how I was thinking about this caused some internal discomfort in you. He said, yeah, it did. The weekend went on with no conflict between the two of us. This continued for several weeks between us and the neighbor. I ended up contacting an attorney. Jeff reached out to the former neighbor who sold them the house. Anyway, I don't need to get into the whole story of it, but we were in two different places. I was saying, I don't know that we have to do anything legally. And I don't know that. I'm not a lawyer. And I hadn't talked to a lawyer, but I had talked to the case manager at the attorney's office that Monday. And Jeff was still of the opinion that we were probably going to have to adjust the property line 3 feet. So one day we got an email from our neighbor, a demand email saying that we had to pick one of 3 options he was presenting by 4 p.m. that day. Jeff texted me at work and said, hey, have you seen the neighbor's email? I read through it, and I suggested that he contact the case manager that I had talked to at the attorney's office. So he did. And at the end of their discussion, he asked the case manager, can I pick option 4, which is we're not deciding anything today? And the case manager said, yeah, you can say that. So Jeff and I were working on the email response to our neighbor when I got home from work. And in the email, I kept including, and we can then discuss further, because that has been Jeff's perspective. We would keep talking with the neighbor. We wouldn't give a hard no. It was still a possibility that the property line had to change. At some point, as we were talking through the wording of the email response, Jeff said, why do you keep adding in there that we're going to discuss this? I said, well, I thought that's how you wanted to keep approaching this. He said, no, I don't think we have to do anything. I said, "Oh, I didn't know you had gotten there." He said, "No, I don't think we're going to have to do anything. So I don't want to keep opening us up to discuss further with the neighbor because that gets his hopes up that we're open to negotiation." I said, "Oh, I didn't know you were there. That's where I have been, but that's not where you have been." He said, "Yeah, I think talking to the case manager helped me get there. We had reached agreement." It came more towards the end of the process. We were still a team as we saw the situation differently. We would talk through our different perspectives. He would listen to my perspective that I wanted to wait until we knew if we had to do anything. But I would also engage him when he would ask, "What do we want to do with this area of the yard?" Accepting influence will not always lead to agreement. Sometimes two people understand each other more fully, and accepting influence allows for that understanding to happen, but they're still in two different places. The evidence may remain ambiguous. Both people may have legitimate needs or viewpoints that can't be perfectly reconciled. The evidence of influence is not always that one person changed sides. It might just be that each person can now hold a more complete, accurate, and respectful understanding of the other, which is really what accepting influence is about. The goal is not to force agreement. It's to make sure both people have had a meaningful opportunity to contribute to the couple's understanding and decisions. Now, everything I have said about validation, generous assumptions, epistemic humility, and accepting influence operates on a basic level of good faith, safety, and mutuality. I often will tell partners that good relational skills used in the wrong relationship can backfire and end up hurting us. The takeaway is not that the pro-relational skill was bad or wrong. The relationship itself, though, might not have been healthy enough to hold the skill. Generous assumptions can become repeated excuses for dishonesty. Epistemic humility can lead to the partner more easily gaslighting. Empathy can keep all the attention on why the person causing harm behaves that way without any accountability for the behavior. Validation can be demanded without accountability. And accepting influence can become one-sided compliance. Vulnerability can provide information that is later weaponized. Compromise can require one person to repeatedly surrender safety, dignity, or their reality. In healthy relationships, influence moves in both directions. Both people should be able to have an impact on the relationship. Both should be able to express uncertainty without having that uncertainty used against them. Being generous with assumptions does not mean ignoring the evidence. And holding your perspective with humility doesn't mean you hold it so loosely that the other person gets to define reality for you. If someone repeatedly uses your openness to make you distrust your own perception, the next relationship skill shouldn't be greater openness. It might be discernment, clear boundaries, or awareness of whether the relationship is emotionally and physically safe. The lesson after an unhealthy relationship should not be, "I should never be vulnerable, trusting, empathetic, or generous again." Sometimes the more accurate lesson is, I need to pay attention to where these qualities are safe, whether they are reciprocated, and when I need to stop offering them. Validation, agreement, and accepting influence are different things. And healthy relationships need room for all three. Validation says, if I am you with your history and the meaning this held for you, I can make sense of your response, your reaction, and your interpretation or meaning that was made. Agreement says, I'm either in the same place or I reached essentially the same conclusion. Accepting influence says, because you matter to me, I am willing to let what you've shared expand my understanding and affect how I see things going forward. We can hurt people without intending to, which means we can understand another person's hurt without accepting that we intended to do harm. We can remain open to correction without pretending that every perspective carries equal weight. And we can stay connected without surrendering our separate viewpoint. The goal of conflict is never to determine which partner gets to define reality. Instead, the goal of conflict is to create a relationship in which both people can contribute to a fuller understanding of it. A healthy relationship does not require us to always see things the same. It requires that neither person's perspective begins as the truth, while the other person's begins as something to disprove. I think one of the gifts of a healthy partnership is that we don't have to stop seeing what we see. But because we know our partner, we listen to them, and we allow them to matter, we become capable of seeing even more. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.